In the last 300 years, few events have changed the Western world as much as the American Revolution, and today, it's often seen as a brave fight for freedom against British control. Now, when we think about the American Revolution, we think of brave soldiers, wise leaders, and moments like the Boston Tea Party, George Washington crossing the Delaware, or the drafting of the Declaration of Independence. However, as we all know, history is always written by the winners, and every big event has more than one side. And what started as an attempt to become independent from British rule soon started to spiral into cruelty, immorality, and in some cases, even more injustice than before. Welcome to Past Perspectives, and this video will show you another part of the revolution, the not-so-glorious parts we don't always hear about in school, and the history writers often like to hide. But before we dive in, make sure to subscribe to our channel so you never miss another history topic you've never learned about in school. With that being said, let's dive into a new perspective on the American Revolution. As you can probably know, the American Revolution didn't just pop out of nowhere. It was a big, complicated event with a lot of different reasons behind it. However, the main push came from the British rulers making rules and laws that the American colonies barely could follow. They started raising their taxes on all kinds of goods, and they started to control trade in ways that hurt the American colonists' pockets. One of the primary reasons for that was the massive debt the British government had accumulated during the French and Indian War. The British argued that this war was fought partly to defend the British territories in America from the French, so they thought it was only fair that the colonies should help to pay for it. And while the tax amounts weren't exceedingly high, the colonies had the feeling that they were unfairly taxed by a distant government where they had no voice or representation. This is where the famous words, "no taxation without representation," were born, and at the same time, big ideas by philosophers like John Locke, Rousseau, and Montesquieu came up. They spread the ideas of individual rights, social contract, and the belief that the governments existed to serve the people and not the other way around. So the mixture between the oppressive British policies and the ideas of enlightenment set the stage for a revolution that probably started out with good intent for the citizen, but then turned out worse than you thought. Officially, the American Revolution began in 1775. However, as we discussed before, the hatred has pent up for years. For example, with things like the Stamp Act of 1765 or the Tea Act of 1773. But the real Independence War and the Revolution started in April 1775, when an open conflict ignited at the battles of Lexington and Concord. During that time, the war saw pivotal moments like the Declaration of Independence on July 4, 1776, and the brutal winter at Valley Forge in 1777 and 1778. With the help of the French allies, the tide turned for the Americans, achieving victory over the British at Yorktown in 1781, and just 2 years later in 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed to recognize American independence and formally end this 8-year-long war. And while this is arguably still the most iconic moment in American history, by freeing themselves from the shackles of British suppression, it brought countless hurdles that made the newly formed nation worse in many ways, and also has brought up challenges for the United States they haven't thought about while they were fighting the glorious War of Independence. Following this patriotic triumph and the celebrated victory over British rule, the euphoria of independence got quickly overshadowed by a tumultuous aftermath and a ton of unforeseen challenges the newborn nation had to face. One of the biggest problems they faced was an economic crisis. Despite them no longer having to face taxation without representation, the United States wasn't suddenly flourishing. It was quite the opposite because they faced some serious money problems. The war against British power was expensive with guns, ships, and soldiers that had to be paid. The US had borrowed heavily from other countries and even its own citizen, which put the country in deep debt. What made it even worse is that the newly formed government quickly realized that they didn't have an easy way to collect money. Sure, there were taxes, but many people weren't able to pay them or avoided paying them at all since they didn't have a system in place yet that would collect them. With no way of having a reliable income for the state, this made the entire debt situation even worse, and they weren't able to pay off what they owed to others. Then there was the economy itself. With the British connections gone, trade got pretty complicated since they had to figure out new trading partners and set their own new rules. And it wasn't smooth sailing at all, to say the least. Since most of the trade the US had before their independence was coming from Britain, they were lacking their most valuable partner. America's biggest companies back then had a direct connection with Britain, and they found themselves in extremely hard times. All of these problems triggered a kind of mini economic crash, with tons of businesses shutting their doors, people losing their jobs because they weren't needed anymore, and therefore families struggled to put food on the table. The cost of everyday items like milk, bread, or firewood became almost unpayable, and this caused the savings of people, if they had any, to shrink tremendously. Families that once lived comfortably found themselves pinching pennies, with many having to sell their belongings or move in with their relatives. This marked a tough time for the United States, especially for those that remembered better days before the war. But it wasn't just hard for the everyday people. It started a huge paradox right at the heart of the new nation. See, the whole American Revolution was about freedom, but at the same time, many of these people that fought for their own freedom owned slaves, yes. While they talked about liberty and equal rights, they were holding other people in chains. And this is when the 3/5 compromise started. This was a rule the states came up with that counted slaves as 3/5 of a person. If you are wondering why that is important, let me explain it to you. It was decided that every 5 slaves would count as 3 people for taxation and representation purposes in the Congress, which means the more slaves a state had, the more power in the Congress they had, without losing a word that slavery was wrong, even though they promised to build a free nation based on equal rights for everybody. However, after the war, instead of making things better for slaves, it actually got way worse. The slave trade grew bigger, and they became the involuntary backbone of the economy, with more slaves forced to work on plantations, producing things like cotton and tobacco. And even though it somehow helped to solve the economic crisis, it created problems that lasted for a long time, created generations of suffering, and later down the road it laid massive tracks for a massive conflict that would then lead to the American Civil War. But the slaves weren't the only ones suffering from the new independence. The Native Americans, the original inhabitants of the land, were treated with huge injustice right after the independence was declared. Just imagine someone walking into your home and telling you it's theirs now. That's pretty much what happened to the Native Americans. When the US became its own country, the new leaders realized they needed more land, so they just kept on taking more and more land from the Native Americans, even if that meant that they had to break treaties and promises they'd made to them. As you can imagine, the Native Americans didn't take this lightly, and this led to the Northwest Indian War, where native tribes and the newly formed American government got into a huge fight over who got to live in the Northwest Territory. For the Native Americans, this wasn't just about the land, though. It was about respect and about a way of life that was being threatened. The impact on these tribes was unimaginable, with many of them forced to move from lands they lived on for centuries. They lost their homes, their hunting grounds, and they had to find new ways to survive. But it didn't stop there, as the clash would reignite over and over again with the US expansion into the West. Today, it's estimated that just during the westward expansion of the US from 1830 to 1840, more than 70,000 Native Americans were relocated. Now, relocation in this case either means voluntary or forced, but we know today that thousands of Native Americans lost their lives because of that. This is something that is often forgotten in the big picture of the American Revolution, but their story and the way they were pushed aside is crucial to understanding that the American Revolution was not the promised independence for everyone. However, the people living in the country weren't the only ones facing huge issues. The newly formed government was dealing with its fair share of struggles as well, since the 13 colonies, or now states, each had their own ideas about how the country should be run, and as you can imagine, they didn't always agree. 2 big groups emerged, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists believed there should be one strong central government, while the Anti-Federalists believed in more power for individual states. Creating a new government wasn't easy. Every state had its own interests, and nobody wanted to feel left out or overpowered. This led to some tense moments like SHAYS Rebellion, when a bunch of farmers, led by Daniel SHAYS, rose up because they believed that the new government wasn't listening to their problems. Trying to bring these 13 states together was a tough struggle that wasn't as easy to deal with as everybody thought it would be. And this is what a lot of people get wrong about the American Revolution. It wasn't just about waving flags and grand speeches about freedom. The aftermath introduced challenges that the young nation hadn't anticipated, and the effects are still felt to this day. If you want to hear more about the history that was rarely talked about in school, make sure to subscribe to Past Perspectives so you never miss another video. And with that being said, thanks for watching, and until next time.